The Western Theater of the American Civil War encompassed major military and naval operations in the states of Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, Kentucky, South Carolina and Tennessee, as well as Louisiana east of the Mississippi River. The Western Theater was the avenue of military operations by Union armies, chief among them the Army of the Tennessee, directly into the agricultural heartland of the South via the major rivers of the region. The Confederacy was forced to defend an enormous area with limited resources. Union operations began with securing Kentucky in Union hands in June 1861. Maj. Gen. Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee had early successes in Kentucky and western Tennessee in 1861–1862, marched towards and captured Vicksburg in 1862–64, and combined with the armies of the Cumberland and of the Ohio, who had been working their way through central Tennessee in 1862–63, to capture Chattanooga in 1864. Chattanooga served as the launching point for Maj. Gen. William T. Sherman, who was put in charge of the combined armies by Grant following his elevation by Abraham Lincoln to General-in-Chief in command over all operations in the Eastern Theater, to capture the Confederate rail hub of Atlanta and march to the Atlantic. Operations in theater concluded with the surrender of Southern forces to the Union Army in North Carolina and Florida in May 1865 following General Robert E. Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Theater of operations. The Western Theater was an area defined by both geography and the sequence of campaigning. It originally represented the area east of the Mississippi River and west of the Appalachian Mountains. It excluded operations against the Gulf Coast and the eastern seaboard. But as the war progressed and William Tecumseh Sherman's Union armies moved southeast from Chattanooga, Tennessee, in 1864 and 1865, the definition of the theater expanded to encompass their operations in Georgia and the Carolinas. Operations west of the Mississippi River were in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. The Virginia Front was by far the more prestigious theater. Here, in the West, the truly decisive battles were fought. Stephen E. Woodworth, Jefferson Davis, and his generals. The West was by some measures the most important theater of the war. Capture of the Mississippi River has been one of the key tenets of Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. Military historian J. F. C. Fuller has described the Union invasion as an immense turning movement, a left wheel that started in Kentucky, headed south down the Mississippi River, and then east, through Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas. With the exception of the Battle of Chickamauga and some daring raids by cavalry or guerrilla forces, the 4 years in the West marked a string of almost continuous defeats for the Confederates, or, at best, tactical draws that eventually turned out to be strategic reversals. Union generals consistently outclassed most of their Confederate opponents, with the possible exception of cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest. Lacking the proximity to the opposing capitals and population centers of the East, the astounding Confederate victories, and the fame of Eastern generals such as Robert E. Lee, George B. McClellan, and Stonewall Jackson, the Western Theater received considerably less attention than the Eastern, both at the time and in subsequent to historical accounts. The near-steady progress that Union forces made in defeating Confederate armies in the West and overtaking Confederate territory went nearly unnoticed. The campaign classification established by the United States National Park Service is more fine-grained than the one used in this article. Some minor NPS campaigns have been omitted and some have been combined into larger categories. Only a few of the 117 battles the NPS classifies for this theater are described. Box text in the right margin show the NPS campaigns associated with each section. Principal commanders of the Western Theater: Lt. Gen. Ulysses S. Grant, USA. Maj. Gen. Henry W. Halleck, USA. Maj. Gen. William T. Sherman, USA, Marge. Gen. George H. Thomas, USA, Marge. Gen. Don Carlos Buell, USA, Marge. Gen. William Rosecrans, USA. Gen. Albert Sidney Johnston, CSA. Gen. PGT Beauregard, CSA. Gen. Joseph E. Johnston, CSA. Gen. Braxton Bragg, CSA. LT. Gen. John Bell Hood, CSA. LT. Gen. Nathan Bedford Forrest, CSA. LT. Gen. Simon Bolivar Buckner, CSA. Marge. Gen. Edmund Kirby Smith, CSA. Marge. Gen. Patrick Cleburne, CSA. Early operations. The focus early in the war was on two critical states, Missouri and Kentucky. The loss of either would have been a crippling blow to the Union cause, primarily because of the successes of Captain Nathaniel Lyon and his victory at Boonville in June. Missouri was held in the Union. The state of Kentucky, with a pro-Confederate governor and a pro-Union legislature, had declared neutrality between the opposing sides. This neutrality was first violated on September 3, when Confederate Marge. Gen. Leonidas Polk occupied Columbus, considered key to controlling the lower Mississippi. 2 days later, Union Brig. Gen. Ulysses S. Grant, displaying the personal initiative that would characterize his later career, seized Paducah. Henceforth, neither adversary respected the proclaimed neutrality of the state, while the most of the state government remained loyal to the Union. The pro-Confederate elements of the legislature organized a separate government in Russellville that was admitted into the Confederate States. This sequence of events is considered a victory for the Union because Kentucky never formally sided with the Confederacy, and if the Union had been prevented from maneuvering within Kentucky, its later successful campaigns in Tennessee would have been more difficult. On the Confederate side, General Albert Sidney Johnston commanded all forces from Arkansas to the Cumberland Gap. He was faced with the problem of defending a broad front with numerically inferior forces, but he had an excellent system of lateral communications, permitting him to move troops rapidly where they were needed, and he had two able subordinates, Polk and Marge. Gen. William J. Hardee. Johnston also gained political support from secessionists in central and western counties of Kentucky via a new Confederate capital at Bowling Green, set up by the Russellville Convention. The alternative government was recognized by the Confederate government, which admitted Kentucky into the Confederacy in December 1861. Using the rail system resources of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, Polk was able to quickly fortify and equip the Confederate base at Columbus. The Union military command in the West, however, suffered from a lack of unified command, organized by November into three separate departments. The Department of Kansas, under Marge. Gen. David Hunter, the Department of Missouri, under Marge. Gen. Henry W. Halleck, and the Department of the Ohio, under Brig. Gen. Don Carlos Buell. By January 1862, this disunity of command was apparent because no strategy for operations in the Western Theater could be agreed upon. Buell, under political pressure to invade and hold pro-Union East Tennessee, moved slowly in the direction of Nashville, but achieved nothing more substantial toward his goal than minor victories at Middle Creek and DeKalb. James A. Garfield and Mill Springs under Brig. Gen. George H. Thomas. In Halleck's department, Grant demonstrated up the Tennessee River by attacking the Confederate camp at Belmont to divert attention from Buell's intended advance, which did not occur. On February 1, 1862, after repeated requests by Grant, Halleck authorized Grant to move against Fort Henry on the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Mississippi rivers. Grant moved swiftly, starting his troops up the Tennessee River toward Fort Henry on river transports on February 2. His operations in the campaign were well coordinated with United States Navy flag officer Andrew H. Foote. The fort was poorly situated on a floodplain and virtually indefensible against gunboats, with many of its guns underwater. Because of the previous neutrality of Kentucky, the Confederates could not build river defenses at a more strategic location inside the state, so they settled for a site just inside the border of Tennessee. Brig. Gen. Lord Tillman withdrew almost all of his garrison on February 5, moving them across country 11 miles to the east to Fort Donelson, with a reduced crew manning the cannons. Tillman fought an artillery duel with the Union squadron for nearly 3 hours before he determined that further resistance was useless. The Tennessee River was then open for future Union operations into the south. Fort Donelson, on the Cumberland River, was more defensible than Henry, and Navy assaults on the fort were ineffective. Grant's army marched cross-country in pursuit of Tiffman's men and attempted immediate assaults on the fort from the rear, but they were unsuccessful. On February 15, the Confederate forces under Brig. Gen. John B. Floyd attempted to escape and launched a surprise assault against the Union right flank, driving McClernand's division back, but not creating the opening they needed to slip away. Grant recovered from this temporary reversal and assaulted the weakened Confederate right, trapped in the fort and the town of Dover, Tennessee. Confederate Brig. Gen. Simon B. Buckner surrendered his command of 11,500 men and many needed guns and supplies to Grant's demand for unconditional surrender. The combined victories at Henry and Donelson were the first significant Union victories in the war, and 2 major rivers became available for invasions into Tennessee. Johnston's forward defense was broken. As Grant had anticipated, Polk's position at Columbus was untenable, and he withdrew soon after Donelson fell. Grant had also cut the Memphis and Ohio Railroad that previously had allowed Confederate forces to move laterally in support of each other. General P.G.T. Beauregard had arrived from the east to report to Johnston in February, and he commanded all Confederate forces between the Mississippi and Tennessee rivers, which effectively divided the unity of command so that Johnston controlled only a small force at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Beauregard planned to concentrate his forces in the vicinity of Corinth, Mississippi, and prepare for an offensive. Johnston moved his force to concentrate with Beauregard's by late March. The preparations for the Union campaign did not proceed smoothly, and Halleck seemed more concerned with his standing in relation to General-in-Chief George B. McClellan than he did with understanding the Confederate Army was divided and could be defeated in detail. Further, he could not agree with his peer, Buell, now in Nashville, on a joint course of action. He sent Grant up the Tennessee River while Buell remained in Nashville. On March 11, President Lincoln appointed Halleck the commander of all forces from the Missouri River to Knoxville, Tennessee, thus achieving the needed unity of command, and Halleck ordered Buell to join Grant's forces at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. On April 6, the combined Confederate forces under Beauregard and Johnston surprised Grant's unprepared Army of West Tennessee with a massive dawn assault at Pittsburgh Landing in the Battle of Shiloh. In the first day of the battle, the Confederate onslaught drove Grant back against the Tennessee but could not defeat him. Johnston was mortally wounded leading an infantry charge that day. He was considered by Jefferson Davis to be the most effective general in the Confederacy at that time. On the second day, April 7, Grant received reinforcements from Buell and launched a counterattack that drove back the Confederates. Grant failed to pursue the retreating enemy and received enormous criticism for this and for the great loss of life, more casualties than all previous American battles combined. Union control of the Mississippi River began to tighten. On April 7, while the Confederates were retreating from Shiloh, Union Maj. Gen. John Pope defeated Beauregard's isolated force at Island No. 10, opening the river almost as far south as Memphis. On May 18, Admiral David Farragut captured New Orleans, the South's most significant seaport. Army Maj. Gen. Benjamin Butler occupied the city with a strong military government that caused considerable resentment among the civilian population. Although Beauregard had little concentrated strength available to oppose a southward movement by Halleck, the Union general showed insufficient drive to take advantage of the situation. He waited until he assembled a large army, combining the forces of Buell's Army of the Ohio, Grant's Army of West Tennessee, and Pope's Army of the Mississippi, to converge at Pittsburgh Landing. He moved slowly in the direction of the critical rail junction at Corinth, taking 4 weeks to cover the 20 miles from Shiloh, stopping nightly to entrench. By May 3, Halleck was within 10 miles of the city but took another 3 weeks to advance 8 miles closer to Corinth, by which time Halleck was ready to start a massive bombardment of the Confederate defenses. At this time, Beauregard decided not to make a costly defensive stand and withdrew without hostilities during the night of May 29. Grant did not command directly in the Corinth campaign. Halleck had reorganized his army, giving Grant the powerless position of second in command and shuffling divisions from the 3 armies into 3 wings. When Halleck moved east to replace McClellan as general-in-chief, Grant resumed his field command, now named the District of West Tennessee. But before he left, Halleck dispersed his forces, sending Buell towards Chattanooga, Sherman to Memphis, one division to Arkansas, and Rosecrans to hold a covering position around Corinth. Part of Halleck's reason for this was that Lincoln desired to capture eastern Tennessee and protect the Unionists in the region, Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Mississippi. While Halleck accomplished little following Corinth, Confederate Gen. Braxton Bragg succeeded Beauregard in command of his 56,000 troops of the Army of Tennessee, in Tupelo, Mississippi, due south of Corinth. But he determined that an advance directly north from Tupelo was not practical. He left Maj. Gens. Sterling Price and Earl Van Dorn to distract Grant and shifted 35,000 men by rail through Mobile, Alabama, to Chattanooga. Even though he did not leave Tupelo until July 21, he was able to reach Chattanooga before Buell could. Bragg's general plan was to invade Kentucky in a joint operation with Maj. Gen. Edmund Kirby Smith, cut Buell's lines of communications, defeat him, and then turn back to defeat Grant. Kirby Smith left Knoxville on August 14, forced the Union to evacuate Cumberland Gap, defeated a small Union force at the Battle of Richmond, and reached Lexington on August 30. Bragg departed Chattanooga just before Smith reached Lexington, while Buell moved north from Nashville to Bowling Green. But Bragg moved quickly and by September 14 had interposed his army on Buell's supply lines from Louisville. Bragg was reluctant to develop this situation because he was outnumbered by Buell. If he had been able to combine with Kirby Smith, Buell, under pressure from the government to take aggressive action, was almost relieved of duty. As he approached Perryville, Kentucky, he began to concentrate his army in the face of Confederate forces there. On October 8, fighting began at Perryville over possession of water sources, and as the fighting escalated, Bragg's Army of Mississippi achieved some tactical success in an assault against a single corps of Buell's Army of the Ohio. That evening Bragg realized that he was facing Buell's entire army and ordered a retreat to Harrodsburg, where he was joined by Kirby Smith's Army of Kentucky on October 10. Despite having a strong combined force, Bragg made no attempt to regain the initiative. Buell was equally passive. Bragg retreated through the Cumberland Gap and returned to Murfreesboro by way of Chattanooga, while Buell was facing Bragg's threat in Kentucky. Confederate operations in northern Mississippi were aimed at preventing Buell's reinforcement by Grant, who was preparing for his upcoming Vicksburg campaign. Halleck had departed for Washington, and Grant was left without interference as commander of the District of West Tennessee. On September 14, Maj. Gen. Sterling Price moved his Confederate Army of the West to Iuka, 20 miles east of Corinth. He intended to link up with Maj. Gen. Earl Van Dorn's Army of West Tennessee and operate against Grant, but Grant sent forces under Maj. Gens. William S. Rosecrans and Edward Ord to attack Price's force at Iuka. Rosecrans won a minor victory at the Battle of Iuka, but poor coordination of forces and an acoustic shadow allowed Price to escape from the intended Union double envelopment. Price and Van Dorn decided to unite their forces and attack the concentration of Union troops at Corinth and then advance into West or Middle Tennessee. In the Second Battle of Corinth, they attacked the fortified Union troops but were repulsed with serious losses. Retreating to the northwest, they escaped pursuit by Rosecrans's exhausted army. But their objectives of threatening Middle Tennessee and supporting Bragg were foiled. As winter set in, the Union government replaced Buell with Rosecrans. After a period of resupplying and training his army in Nashville, Rosecrans moved against Bragg at Murfreesboro just after Christmas. In the Battle of Stones River, Bragg surprised Rosecrans with a powerful assault on December 31. Pushing the Union forces back to a small perimeter against the Stones River. But on January 2, 1863, further attempts to assault Rosecrans were beaten back decisively and Bragg withdrew his army southeast to Tullahoma. In proportion to the size of the armies, the casualties at Stones River made it the bloodiest battle of the war. At the end of the campaign, Bragg's threat against Kentucky had been defeated, and he effectively yielded control of Middle Tennessee.